Today, we're talking about the state of local media in St. Louis, and we're particularly interested in how print journalism is doing. We've got an all-star panel joining us today. That includes Gilbert Bailon, the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Jeanette Cooperman, a longtime writer at St. Louis Magazine, and former Alderman Antonio French. There is so much to talk about. But before we get to our panel, my first guest is here to provide some context. You might think St. Louis has always been a one-newspaper town, or that the only real rival to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Well, fortunately, my first guest has a memory that's longer than yours and a greater knowledge of media history. Frank Absher is the executive director of the St. Louis Media History Foundation. He's also a radio veteran, and he's joining us today to remind us where we came from and how we got to this point. So, Frank Absher, welcome to the program.
They would start out a call-in show with, "Hello, is that you're talking to me? Am I on the air?"
Right. And that's a great opening there. I can tell you're a pro. Now, you worked at KMOX during what sounds like some glorious years. When were you there, and what was that like?
1979 through 1983, it was radio heaven in the sense that it was the best of the best. It was what you dreamed of when you were at the one-horse town in the 1,000-watt daytime stations, which is where I started. And it was, of course, the best that CBS could buy, so a lot can be said for that. But, of course, everything's changed, and that's why we're here. Because if you look back at history, way back, you'll see how journalism has evolved over the years, and the methods of the delivery of journalism have also evolved.
And as you and I were talking yesterday, you mentioned just how many newspapers used to be in St. Louis. Give us a sense of how big this media stratosphere was.
I have a listing on our St. Louis Media History website of every publication that has been in St. Louis, and there are thousands. I'm talking about trade journals, medical journals. There were black newspapers, Jewish newspapers, Catholic, Lutheran, agriculture, communist newspapers, entertainment publications, political papers, arts papers, business newspapers, and, of course, just your regular everyday, we're delivering the information to your newspapers.
And a lot of foreign language newspapers, too. I mean, what kind of range was there with that?
Korean. I'm reading from my list because otherwise I'd forget. Swedish newspapers, Bosnian, Czechoslovakian, Spanish, Italian, French, German. That's the ones that I came up with off the top of my head.
That's a big range.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to those years you were at KMOX, what was the competition like to break news at that point?
There was no breaking news competition because let's go back a few more years to when radio really came into its own in terms of delivering news. That would have been the late 1930s. Before then, you heard no news on the radio, or if there were news, they would be reading it from the newspaper. But as things started to heat up in Europe and Edward R. Murrow and his assemblage started broadcasting information about what was going on in the rest of the world, news became an integral part of radio. And because there was no delay, as there is with print media, people started relying more on radio for breaking information and print media for detailed information.
So it was almost like radio played the role of the internet today.
That's right.
You could get the updates in real time.
The difference between radio then and the internet now is that people came to rely on and depend on trusted voices, the Murrows of the world, and put stock in and faith in their reports. Now on the internet, you don't know who it is, and so you don't know whether you can trust it.
When did we see radio start to scale back its newsroom, this idea of having so many reporters out there in the field?
The Telecommunications Act, I believe it was 1996, deregulated radio. Up until that point, radio had to prove, if it could get its license, it had to prove that it was serving in the public interest, and that involved news broadcasts as well. Many of the radio stations in those days would simply rip and read. They would take the news off of the teletype, walk into the studio, and read a few headlines. But there were stations all over the country that had full news departments. And I'll go back to the 1960s here in St. Louis. There was a radio station, KXOK, that was rock and roll, that was aimed at the teenager. They had a full news department of 5 or 6 reporters, and they had news broadcasts every hour.
At the music station?
Yes, absolutely. WIL, the competition, did the same thing. So they kept you informed, and they were constantly competing. They would give out money for the best news tips. It became sort of a competition that resulted in better product.
And you said that started to change because of an FCC decision?
No, it was a government decision that came down from Congress that deregulated what radio had to do. Radio had to prove up until that point, as did television, in order to get their licenses from the federal government, that they were serving the community. They were doing it with public service announcements, they were doing it with community programming, and they were doing it with news broadcasts.
And that changed then.
That's all gone.
And at that point, people could just do what they wanted, just do strictly music.
And they could also be quite opinionated. And that led us to where we are today, because back then, if you were opinionated, you had to offer equal opportunity to the other side to express its opinion.
You couldn't just be the right-wing radio station.
No,
had to have both sides. It's interesting in terms of this opinion journalism. Our producer Evie Hemphill talked last week to Sylvester Brown. He's a St. Louis native. He started his own print publication in the 1980s. That's a monthly that was called Take 5 magazine. He went on to be a columnist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and after that he went to work in book publishing. Most recently, in 2019, he published a book called When We Listen, based on his work with young people through the Sweet Potato Project. It's a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And he recalled the 80s and 90s as the golden years for print as well. Here's what he said about that.
When I came into the business, I started my publication in 1987. And it was a wonderful time for that because we had several black newspapers, the American, you had the Sentinel, and you had the Argus. But you also had the Riverfront Times, which is very liberal, in-your-face, open publication. So it was us against like the more conservative publications, like the Post-Dispatch and other mainstream media. It was a wonderful time because what you had on the air and in print was authentic black thought with independent reporters and journalists. It even infiltrated radio. WGNU, a station on the AM dial, that almost had 24/7 talk shows. And half of them, if not more, were African-American, with African-American hosts, editors, blah, blah, blah. They were even infiltrating major television news stations because once you read about it and you got those opinions, you just couldn't tell your story from a white perspective because it was in print. And so they had to go to these journalists and at least touch on these issues. Even Channel 9 would host their town hall meetings with African-American hosts and African-American issues. So the 90s were really a wonderful, eclectic time. What happened was, in the early 2000s, the full force of the Internet came into play. What these major news organizations found out was that there was gold in those conservative hills. If you recall, at that time, newspapers were going out of business, they were going bankrupt, they were cutting their staff, they were offering all these buyouts because it was desperate times. But what they found out was, because of the Internet and cable news programs, that there was dollars, money, millions and millions of dollars from conservative viewers, conservative readers.
And that's Sylvester Brown, former St. Louis Post-Dispatch columnist. He sees a real decline in black voices coinciding with the rise of conservative outlets, things like Fox News and some of those radio stations that you talked about. But Frank, I'm thinking about Take 5 magazine and these publications that have sort of had their moment in St. Louis and then gone away. And I know that both preserving them and honoring the people who've worked there, that's part of your work. What do you see as the role of the St. Louis Media History Foundation?
Exactly that, to preserve so that people now can see what came before. For example, in St. Louis in 1923 and 1924, there were 5 Klan newspapers being published every week. Things they weren't hiding behind anything. It was the Missouri Fiery Cross, the Missouri Klan Courier,
That's
the Patriot.
Crazy to think about.
Yes. So those voices were out there, and we want to make sure that we don't lose track of the fact that existed. That's part of us. Sociologists can look at these records that we have and determine what was going on in St. Louis in the 1960s by listening to the radio we have, looking at the newspapers that are on microfilm and what have you, and saying, this is what was important to the people. 35, 40, 50 years from now, they'll look back and say, oh, look at this. They had this infestation coming across the ocean from China, and look at all the things that closed down. That's what we're doing. We are preserving what came before.
And at the same time, I know you're kind of a student of this history, and you've paid a lot of attention to the disruption of the radio industry. I'm wondering, with the disruption currently that's going on in print, does this kind of disruption present new opportunities?
You know what? I'm going to be interested in listening to your panel because these folks are on the cutting edge, and you've got a very good group of people here. If you look back at the history of radio was declared dead in 1950 because all of the stars from radio, the Jack Bennys, the Gracie Allen and George Burns, they migrated from radio to television. And all of these shows that people listened to on the radio were going away. Radio was dead. Nobody was going to listen. So they reinvented themselves. They came up with a new product to give to the public that the public said, we didn't know we liked that. They listened to disc jockeys. They listened to homemaker shows. And because of that reinvestment or reinvention, so to speak, radio bought another 50 years of life without worrying about what tomorrow might bring. This is what print has to do now. Print has to look back and say, okay, we've got the internet delivering information. We've got all of this stuff going on around us that's already giving people those things. What can we present to people that they will pay for, that they will want? They have to make sure that they've got a product that people will buy, and we don't know what that product is right now. But if print is to survive, they have to reinvent themselves now.
And that's a challenge from Frank Absher of the St. Louis Media History Foundation. So, Frank, thank you so much for joining us today.
Love it.
We need to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to sit down with that panel that Frank is so excited to hear from, and I know I am too. So this is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. Our topic today is the state of local journalism, and I can't think of a better panel to discuss it with us than the one that we have here. First, we've got Gilbert Bailon. He's the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Gilbert, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we're also joined by Jeanette Cooperman. She was a longtime staff writer at St. Louis Magazine, and before that, a longtime writer at the Riverfront Times. And she recently left St. Louis Magazine to write essays for The Common Reader. That's a publication of Washington University. Jeanette, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And our final guest today is Antonio French. He's a former St. Louis alderman and mayoral candidate who found himself covering the protests in Ferguson 6 years ago using Vine and Twitter. And now he's started a pair of print newspapers. So, Antonio, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Gilbert, I want to start with you. With coronavirus and all the economic uncertainty everywhere in the world right now, it does make me a little bit worried about the media. I know we're all reliant on advertising dollars and people having events, wanting to promote them. What are you thinking as you look at these next few weeks and the landscape that we're dealing with economically here?
Well, from a news standpoint, this is a critical time for all forms of media to give people good information. I mean, just this morning we wrote that or posted that Mercy was opening a drive-through clinic for they can be testing. We also have Sam Page, the county executive, announcing that 250 people can't gather in the county. This kind of information is really vital. Business-wise, it's going to be an economic drain on the entire country, much less St. Louis region, and it's really unknown from that standpoint. But as far as journalists, I think our role is no more important now than ever before because people are looking for that credible information.
It seems like one of these times where page views are going to be through the roof. People are going to be snapping up copies of the newspaper at the same time that advertisers might be feeling worry and maybe not wanting to double down. Are you worried about that equation?
Well, we're worried about it, but I think if we do our job, and we have a lot of traffic online. I mean, I know people think of the Post-Dispatch as print. We've been around since 1878. That's true, but we're way more than that. And so we're able to be on people's phones, iPads, our e-edition, other things, where we can get information in real time, and that gives us an advantage to fill that gap. But with the advertising, yeah, we're concerned about. I think everybody is who's in the media business right now because it's unknown.
Antonio, as a newer publication, much newer, when you look at the difference between the 1870s and a year and a half ago, how is the coronavirus news affecting your plans?
Yeah, so I approach it a little differently. You know, not only do I lead a newsroom, I also lead a business as the owner of our publications. And so we look at the situation of uncertainty in a different light. And so we've made the decision for us to halt the print publication of the Northsider and the Southsider for 2 weeks. Till we can assess the situation. You know, we have the largest combined weekly circulation of any weekly, 50,000 papers in the city. And what we know is that it's going to be a little harder to get those 50,000 papers picked up off the racks next week as compared to last week. Just because
people won't be out and about.
Many of our places that we distribute the paper are closed.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the places that we would normally distribute lots of papers are seeing less traffic, are going to see less traffic. So we're going to assess the situation. We'll continue to publish all our stories on our website, metrostl.com, but we are taking the next 2 weeks to assess the print.
So that's a scary step to have to take. Are you going to be able to make the payroll for your staff without the print revenue coming in?
Yeah, so all our staff will continue to work, continue to be paid, continue to write their stories daily on metrostl.com, continue to do their work. But we will be assessing over the next 2 weeks, you know, whether we are shifting more to online as this crisis kind of works its way out, or if there is still a need for, as the places reopen in the city, for us to have our publications on those newsstands.
Okay, so a suspension of that print edition.
For 2 weeks.
Yeah. Now, Jeanette, I know you're not on the business side of things, and I bet right now that feels good not to be on.
It's a relief, yes.
Is it a relief to be out of the for-profit journalism model now, working for this book of essays at Washington University?
It's a huge relief. It feels, honestly, it is. It feels like you can just focus on the ideas and what you're writing and not have to worry about how it will strike somebody. I know with social media, it got too easy to groan over the fact that our highest clicks were for things like how to wear leggings, and it's like, how much do you take that feedback to heart? We could do a whole publication on the blow dry bar.
Just giving the people what they want.
Yeah, so it was like, learn it, realize it, ignore it. And it was a hard balance.
And so now that you're at this point where you can kind of write about whatever you want to write about, is that hard with something like the coronavirus that's taking up so much oxygen in the room right now? Is it hard to even think about anything else?
Yeah, I've been going back and forth because I do 3 shorter pieces a week. And I thought it looks a little surreal to write about something different. By the same token, we need a little relief. And so it's a tightrope there. The long piece I'm working on is on contagion, but it's on different kinds of contagion, moral contagion, emotional contagion. Contagion is something that, becomes its own phenomenon, the contagion of fear. So I'm trying to look at other aspects of it because we'll go crazy if we just worry about distancing and viruses and we'll lose our minds.
Gilbert, I'm wondering how you manage that with your newsroom. You've got, I imagine, still the biggest newsroom in town, and yet there's a lot of people on the sports beat. All these sports games are now suspended. Do you move those guys over to news coverage and say, you're on the coronavirus beat? How are you handling that?
Well, right now they're doing a lot of coronavirus-related coverage. We have people in Jupiter with the Cardinals. We had people preparing to cover the Blues. It's also in our arts and entertainment, too. So concerts, people who anything that of large groups, which are many activities. It's also going to affect restaurants, dining, other parts. So what we're doing, we're like everybody else trying to gather this, but what we're trying to do is make sure we have information that people can use. It's really important. We have lists of closing. That sounds very basic, but it's information that's really very popular. Can I go places? We had, can I go to the fish fry? There are things that people have very practical, but there's really health things. What's open? What should I go to? So we're looking at it from a consumer standpoint, but we'll have to assess this. Right now, the leagues don't even know. They know that's a couple weeks. Is opening day going to happen? We don't know. So we're going to play it by ear. But right now, that's affecting the leagues and the athletes and the entertainers and other people. So we're still covering that, but we'll have to reassess.
If you're listening to this conversation, we want to hear from you, and we're going to move on from this coronavirus question, and that's where we want to center our listeners here. We want to know, what do you think the St. Louis media does a good job of covering, and where do we fall short? You can give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us a tweet at STL on air or email us at talk@stlpublicradio.org. And Tony, I want to talk to you just a bit about your journey. You were a St. Louis alderman. And you started going to Ferguson and documenting what was happening there in real time. You were using things like Twitter and Vine. Was that in part because you felt like the mainstream media was missing the story?
Yeah, I think so. What I knew was that is that you weren't really going to find out, I felt, what was actually happening just from the mainstream media. And so it did not occur, the incident didn't occur very far away from my home. So I went down the street, down West Florissant into Ferguson, to find out what was happening myself. And then what I saw was very different than what was being reported at the time. And so I started tweeting. And primarily my first audience during that was local reporters, hoping that they would see it and then come down and cover it. And then, it kind of took off from there.
And where you felt like you weren't seeing what was really going on, do you think part of that was that the media here is, frankly, so white?
Yeah, a lot has changed over the last 6 years. I mean, I think most of the newsrooms in town are a little bit more intentional about trying to have, coverage that is more reflective. But if you go back to 2014, most of the news coverage in the city, I felt, was very much top down, very much looking at incidents that occur in the black community from a largely white perspective. And that is how that story started to be reported. Actually, I've said this before. The first report I got on this incident was a tweet from the Post-Dispatch Twitter account, and the headline said, "Police shooting sparks mob reaction." And when I read the story actually was a better written story than the headline suggested. And so my first tweet regarding Ferguson was a tweet to the Post-Dispatch saying, "Mob, you could have just as easily said community." And so then I left and went to go see what was happening myself. Gilbert,
it seems, I guess I would be skeptical that your social media team would use that word today, the idea of a mob, if a protest had gathered on the street. Do you feel like people are covering things in a different way, that Ferguson was a wake-up call for all of us, that we need to think about these things so carefully and words like that?
I think the staff does cover things differently, and we're better sourced, to Antonio's point. I think we have people in the community. Now, are we as well sourced as we should be? That's a work in progress. Things change. Communities change. And there are multiple communities that we cover. We're covering 3 million people, 12 counties, 2 states. So do we know everything in every place? No. But we are more conscious about that in some of our reporting with the ticket, what was happening in municipal courts, things like that we kind of knew about, but we really dug into. Is there more ground to be done? Yes. But I think we're better sourced than we were before. That includes reporters and photographers who spent a lot of time out there. Antonio became a source. I mean, he was not just doing his thing on social media. He became a source for us, among other people who we still talk to regularly. But it's an evolving piece. The communities change, our staff changes, so it is nothing we can say, we've got this down, but we are much more aware of how we're covering many communities and trying to be more sensitive.
Jeanette, you and I have both worked at smaller newsrooms that try to sort of cover everything, but it's almost impossible when you only have 4 or 5 people working there. And frankly, in the case of some of the publications you and I have worked for, again, a very white set of journalists. Mm-hmm. What are the struggles to cover a major event, something like Ferguson or something like the coronavirus, when you've just got a few people?
Yeah, you have to pick. You have to narrow down, and you have to find a way to bring meaning instead of trying to pretend that you can do 24/7 reporting. You have to know your limits first, and then you have to do what people who are doing that kind of reporting can't do. Step back, think about it, find the patterns, go deeper, do a little historical research. The luxury that we usually had was time, at least a little bit more breathing room. And so you try and bring some meaning and you pull things together, and sometimes it's a barrage for people to try and follow each little tiny update. And if they can read something all in one place that forms a narrative, it lets them reflect a little bit. It's a little bit of a breathing space.
So the thing that long-form journalism can do.
Yes.
Antonio, I'm wondering then how that experience of being out there, being a source to people and breaking news on Twitter, how that led you to say, you know what, I'm going to actually start a print publication. I know you had more of a newsletter before this, but to go whole hog on 2 newspapers, that's a very unusual thing to do in 2018, 2019.
Yeah, it was not my first attempt. We did Public Defender many years ago. I think we were able to publish maybe 8 issues of that before we went to the web. We have published over 120 issues so far, the North Sider and the South Sider. So that little practice helped. But I think there is still a need for print media. And what I know very, very closely, especially from the Ferguson incident, is that you have different audiences from different mediums. So the audience that I had on Twitter is very different than the audience I would have on Facebook or in print media. As an alderman, trying to reach my constituents in the 21st Ward in North St. Louis, I can send out 1 million tweets, but they're not seeing it. Mm-hmm. What they really wanted was something in their hands to be able to flip through and process and ingest at their own speed. And that's where the North Sider started 11 years ago. I felt that there just wasn't a lot of positive news about North St. Louis. If you Googled North St. Louis, chances are it was going to be a crime story or a very negative story. So we started the North Sider to just have some positive news about what's happening in our own community from the perspective of people who live in our community.
And then you kind of doubled down and said, let's do the South Sider too.
Yeah, the same need existed in South St. Louis. And I think that is the future of local media. I think you're seeing a lot of consolidation on the national level. And these large mega corporations that own all these different newspapers are just consolidating. And if someone wants to know what's happening in Washington, D.C. or New York, they'll go to New York Times or Washington Post. But there are very few sources for what's happening within a mile or 2 of your home. And I think that's the future of local media and print media here in St. Louis.
St. Louis does seem to have an inordinate amount of print publications, if you think about it. I mean, we have, not only is our daily newspaper still daily, which is not true of many similarly sized cities. We still have an alt-weekly, which a lot of people don't have. We have these 2 food monthlies, which is unheard of in any other city I've lived in. I'm wondering, Gilbert, if you have thoughts on why print continues to do well here in St. Louis compared to maybe some other cities where they've seen such a shrinking of that footprint.
I think part of it is the culture here in St. Louis. There's an intense interest in local communities. There's people care about the history and what's happening in their neighborhoods, probably more than when I lived in L.A. or Dallas, which was big areas with 6 to 18 million people. Here, it's more of a, I wouldn't say small town, but a feel of a community. Mm-hmm. And because of that, people care about their food and music, and they care about their local sports teams and high school sports and things of that nature. As Antonio said, they also care about their neighborhoods. And because our paper is not as big as it used to be as far as staffing, we're not as good at being in Kirkwood and South County or Northside or even in the county as we used to be. And because of that, there is an opportunity, and there are people filling the void. I mean, the problem we have with a lot of those is what's the business model? How do you sustain that? It's not that there's interest. People have huge interest. You can look at Nextdoor. You can look at various websites that are geared towards geographic areas. There's a huge interest. The interest is where do advertisers want to be and how do you sustain that? Will people want to pay for that information? We're all in that together. We're a little bigger, but some of the small people also that are smaller publications are also influenced by the same thing as how do I sustain this? But we know there's an appetite.
Yeah, and our business model. I'm not a genius here. I didn't invent the wheel here. We're just kind of copying what the old suburban journals used to do. Mm-hmm. And people appreciated seeing that publication that was really reflective of their immediate community. And so we've just kind of replicated that with the North Sider and the South Sider and some of our future plans. But I think there is a need there, and so far we've seen advertisers willing to support that because, the advertising cost is cheaper and they're targeting a more immediate area, versus larger publications or larger, media outlets that are sweeping the region. You get to advertise to a smaller group of people.
Do you think people are more willing to pay for news these days now that so many national publications are forcing people to pay for their website, that creates some sort of trickle-down effect? Jeanette, any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, because for years I watched our younger digital natives at the magazine insist that we could not have a paywall because we had to be free, we had to get those clicks. And it felt like all of us kind of undervalued ourselves, to be honest. We were doing really solid journalism and we were not convinced that it had any monetary value. And we couldn't get the ad revenue online. that could change, is changing. But yeah, I think once that whole shift starts and people begin to say, no, this is worth something, we can all follow along. Before, it was impossible to break off and say, we're going to make you pay, when people could get similar information for free from another outlet.
Gilbert, have you seen any benefit from those attitudes changing?
Yes, and we are growing our digital subscriptions. It's, we are a little bit late to the game here in St. Louis, consciously, because we felt that having the information out there for free for a long time was important to drive traffic. Now we're looking at driving traffic, but also getting money so we can pay for our operations. And because of that, I think that the culture has changed. People pay for Netflix and Spotify and Hulu and various other services that will pay if it's valuable. I think sometimes that people don't always necessarily think news information, whether it's ours or somebody else, is valuable. Right now, it's extremely valuable. And by the way, we took the paywall down for our coronavirus. Anybody can go to our website and read anything about the coronavirus for free. We would like you to subscribe. We think we're valuable. But if that information is what you're really critically for, you can get that. And other big newspapers have done that around the country.
For this specific issue.
For this topic, yes.
We're talking to Gilbert Bailon, the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, as well as Jeanette Cooperman of the Common Reader, and Antonio French, former alderman who recently started the North Sider and the South Sider. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Welcome back. We're discussing the state of local journalism in St. Louis with an all-star panel. That includes St. Louis Post-Dispatch editor Gilbert Bailon, Jeanette Cooperman, now of the Common Reader, and Antonio French, the publisher of the North Sider and the South Sider, two new community newspapers. And we want to hear from you. We've got a ton of tweets, and I'll try to get some of those in. But if you want to join our conversation by phone, let us know, what do you think the St. Louis media does a good job of covering, and where do we fall short? You can give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us a tweet at STL On Air or email us at talk@stlpublicradio.org. Now, we did reach out to a few more voices to get their perspective on this. Reached out to the St. Louis American, and they were not interested in being part of this conversation. But we did talk to Liz Miller, who's the former editor of Feast magazine and now the managing editor of the Riverfront Times, where she manages their food coverage. And I was very interested in this topic in particular of why food is such a hotly contested beat in this town. If you talk to journalists, it seems to be the area where there is the most competition to break news. And so we wanted to ask her about that. And she said that in part, it's a matter of the St. Louis food scene doing really well, that people are excited to cover this growing scene.
There is this, when you're in food media, almost sort of echo chamber effect where a release might come through or you get a tip and immediately that at least two other people, if not 4 to 5 in town, are either already on it or about to be on it. And I think that, that's because we know that this is content people want. So sometimes, honestly, it feels a little silly to be like, okay, I got to put my head down and really focus on this story about pasta or something. But you do, because you want to be early and you want your readers to get the most thorough and accurate story from you.
And that's Liz Miller, the managing editor of the Riverfront Times. And she also mentioned that just knowing that people are wildly interested in this food coverage, that drives a lot of this heated competition. And as a former newspaper editor, I feel like we were very influenced by the internet in that it allowed us to know what people actually wanted to read, not just what they said they wanted to read. And in some cases, that could be kind of destructive. Jeanette, I'm wondering if there are things where you found yourself covering things or you've seen publications covering things just because there's clicks there's page views there, as opposed to it necessarily being the best thing to cover.
Sure, but I think what you can do is solve it by going at the topic, but then trying to do it in the most substantive way possible. People might be really excited about food, but you can really go somewhere with that. It doesn't have to be something shallow and quick take. So the trick is taking that info that comes through social media and then deepening it and expanding it and giving something back that has some substance.
At the same time, I also wonder about having a dozen or more food writers in the city and maybe 1 or 2 reporters focused on criminal justice reform. Antonio, do you think maybe some of our priorities are out of whack? Or do we have to give the people what they want to make the business model work?
Well, I think that goes to a question of how different publications operate. Many publications are owned by larger corporations who are very conscious of the bottom line and what is selling. And as you know, you'll get a lot of those stories that aren't very substantive are the ones that will get the most page views. For us, we've been a print-first publication, and we're building our website, metrostl.com, over the next few years. And so we've really been focusing on neighborhoods, what we hear from people as far as what they want to hear and read in the paper. But food coverage and restaurant coverage is really just another form of local news coverage. I mean, that's very much a part of the culture, just as much as prep sports or, what's happening at the church or down at City Hall. It's just another form of local news where people, see things that they know and they want to know what's happening there.
Gilbert, is it hard to get people to pay attention to the big serious news, or do you find there's a hunger for that as well as the clickbait type stuff?
I think there is a hunger for it. And you look at our coverage of Steve Stenger, what happened with that. We look at our coverage of people dying in the county jail. You look at our
Were there big page views for those stories?
Yes, but we don't really measure it by does it get more than the crime brief or the some restaurant closing. We don't. It's not competitive in that way. We have, and there are also different staffs. We have people devoted. We have a full-time dining critic, Ian Frobe. We have a food writer who cooks food and talks about Dan Neiman. We also have feasts, so we put in energy into that. We also have full-time court reporters. We have police reporters. We have people who look at the criminal justice system. Tony Messenger writes about it a lot. Mm-hmm. So it's not one for the other. It's not give and take. But we think there are different audiences for that. If we're not doing watchdog accountability reporting, we're not doing our job. But that doesn't preclude us from doing food and music and other things that of local interest.
Jeanette?
I just wish that there were a measure of the stories that people remember, the stories they talk about. You can look at least the length of time somebody spends on a page. This just pure click measurement has got to go away.
That is not the best metric of what actually works.
That really makes for a misshapen publication.
We do look at that. We have a blended metric, so we call it time spent or how much. So if there's some stories that, like, we'll do a Sunday story that might be lengthier. People spend a lot of time with it. That's very valuable to us. It may not have as many users, but we know the people who got it really are editorials, columns, other things like that. So there are some other metrics besides just and the reality is the way the economy's changed with online is clicks aren't necessarily making us a whole lot of money. I mean, it's important, but it's not the be-all. So,
Antonio?
One of the things that we focus on in our newsroom, too, is that, we are not the paper of record. We don't try to compete with the Post-Dispatch. And as a weekly publication, we look for, if there's a story like a Stinger story or something, we don't look to break the news. We look to see what we can add to that discussion. We have a little bit more time, so we try to have longer form stories that we can add something to the public discussion.
We asked on Twitter that very question I've been raising with our callers, which is what does the media do well and what could we do better? And McPherson responded, sometimes it seems as if reporters and editors get distracted by publicity stunts and by narratives on Twitter. His example was we get lots of coverage of close the workhouse or too many tips, but little coverage of budget-busting problems like pension funds in St. Louis City and County. Gilbert, do you think that's a fair criticism?
I don't think Twitter is causing that. I think, if anything, it's more there are so many good stories out there. How can you, to Jeanette's, it's just the same thing having 5 people. We have a newsroom of a little over 80. That's everybody. That's photographers. So trying to cover a region, we have to make choices. And are there some stories that we sometimes just say we don't think we could get the resources to put into that? We have to make choices with. So are there good stories that we're missing? Yeah, pension funds or other. But we cover government very well. We've exposed we were very aggressive with Sunshine Acts and other things. We've sued the state of Missouri, who wouldn't give us information on people seeking medical marijuana licenses, got some information, didn't get everything we wanted. But those are the types of things we try to do. But yes, are there gaps? Because there's just not as much media as there used to be, as many people doing it. Yeah.
Let's go to the phone lines. Amanda is calling from St. Louis. Amanda, hi. You're on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I just want to say first that Jeanette could write a list of the names of my family members, and I would still read it. She's, I think, the best writer in St. Louis and has been for a long time.
I feel exactly the same way, so thank you for saying that so well.
My question is, I'm a print journalism Mizzou graduate, and I may have literally been the last year when copying and pasting was a physical act, and we waxed up the pages for print. And so I kind of finished my schooling and had grown up in the era of sort of news as an authoritative thing that was handed to you or read to you by the great men of network news journalism, all of that. And so I want to know what the panel thinks about finding a balance between sort of authority and expertise, which I have a default to valuing, and that's obviously showing both my age and kind of my social status, and as well as involving these community voices and reaching outside of this idea of authority as a handed down thing. How do you make that work in a journalism enterprise?
Amanda, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Does anyone want to volunteer to take that on?
I will say this, is that I think that is one of the strengths of print media. It is something about holding something in print that gives it a certain amount of authority, more so than just sharing a blog post or something that you saw on Twitter. For an audience, especially an older audience, seeing that in print really means something. And for us, what we try to do is, you talk about the authoritative voices. We try to add context to stories. We try to look for people from the community that have something to bring to a public discussion and elevate those voices. And I think that's our strength.
Let's go back to the phone lines. Tom is calling from Afton. Tom, hi, you're on St. Louis on the air.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Don Corrigan, who I guess is the editor-publisher of the South County Times and Kirkwood Webster Times, which has that hyper-local focus, and the little bit of articles that they do, I think, are very thoughtful about like town council meeting issues and that sort of thing. But my question is maybe Mr. French or one of your other guests would be good on this. I think there's a real important historical moment occurred here in St. Louis that will definitely be reflected for historians, in our media, and that is this: during the Ferguson protests and then later the protests around the Stockley verdict, I think I heard maybe former State Representative Bruce Franks say something to the effect of, "This is not your daddy's civil rights movement." And in that first year after Ferguson, there was some conflict between the sort of people who are associated with the Black Church, the NAACP, the Democratic Party establishment, and then the younger generation. And now, 6 years later, I think we can see that generational divide line up with the Democratic political candidates. When Bernie Sanders was here last week, or this week, you had Tashara Jones, Cori Bush, Rasheen Aldrich, all up there speaking.
Tom, thank you for that. And yeah, I do think there has been somewhat of a shift. I'm wondering how that plays into maybe news consumption, Antonio.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a division there. And if you talk about that's a whole separate discussion about the Democratic nomination there. But I will say this, is that our audience for our print publications, as I spoke about earlier, is different than our audience in social media and in the online. So the print publication is an older publication, but a bit more moderate than a lot of the comments and feedback we get from the online and the social media audience. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, is a division there that we're conscious of.
And there is one last clip I wanted to get to today. We asked Liz Miller, the managing editor of the RFT, about how she expects the print landscape to change over the course of the next decade, and she expects more upheaval to come. Let's listen.
Well, I can tell you that the most recent decade was extremely challenging for print media. I think that, looking back even 20 years, you see how much that the way we tell stories has had to change. And I think we are, slowly slouching toward a digital-only era, at least when we think about local journalism and local publications. And I think that that's something we shouldn't be scared of. I don't work on the sales side, so I don't really want to speak to that, although I know that presents monetary and monetizing issues. But I really think that our job as journalists is to tell stories and be of service to our readers. And so if we can find a way to produce content that is of the same quality, that is as well reported, which is obviously happening all over this country right now, and to still make money at it, which is the crucial portion, that we shouldn't be afraid of that change.
And that's Liz Miller of the Riverfront Times. Gilbert, do you think the Post-Dispatch will end up moving online only in the next decade?
I don't think so entirely. I think there's still going to be an audience for print. Will it be smaller? Probably. That's been the trend. And to Antonio's point, there is a very hardcore print audience who want certain things, from comics to obituaries to just liking to leaf through. We also have an e-edition of our paper where people can go on their computer and literally leaf through the paper as well. So you don't even have to get the print paper. You can get the digital subscription and get that. So there is that ability to do that. You find things that way. The difference when you read online, if you don't, sometimes you miss things. When you go through, you're leafing through the paper, whether it's the New York Times or the Post-Dispatch or any other Metro paper, you find things you happen upon that you probably will read and find interest in. So I think that will be around, but we are going to go more digital, and we already are. I mean, we have multimedia, we do podcasts, we do video, we do all these things that it's a big part of our business. The information love is not gone away. People want it. I think I use the analogy of what's happened to the music business. People still want music. How they get it is very different. How we watch movies are very different. People still want information. So I'm optimistic that people will want it. We have to figure out the business model.
Jeanette, Liz said we shouldn't be afraid of this. Do you think she's right about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think print means something you read. I would like to see readers come along even farther. I totally agree with Gilbert. What I miss is that browsing, that happenstance, catching on to something. And I need to make myself do those flip-through things just so I can have that experience. But no, I think the act of reading is what matters because it lets you do it at your own pace and it lets you think and it gives you more information on a single topic generally, and you can go deeper. You can create a world that people can meet halfway imaginatively, and that's a lot less passive than just sitting in front of a screen or even, listening.
One last question in what is our last minute or so here is a huge question, and that is, do you think with social media driving so much, we're all sort of retreating to our own little echo chambers? How can we find or make people engage with news that doesn't just conform to the point of view they're coming in with? Anyone have the solution on that?
Yeah. I think a lot of these questions are related. So this is not exclusive to journalism. It's really a business question. You're seeing the same thing in music and in movies. People are just consuming things in different ways. Some people are watching movies on their phones. Some people still want to go to a theater. I think one of the advantages of print as well, though, is that you get to see a lot of different stories, a lot of information all accumulated in the same place and can filter through it that way versus almost like instead of an album, the single consumption in music industry where you're just consuming singles. I think it does help to have context. Mm-hmm. And so when you put your stories in print, laid out in a certain way, it's consumed differently. And so I don't think we should be, going back to the earlier question, I don't think we should be afraid of that. We should embrace that people are consuming things in different ways, and there's just different audiences, and we have to satisfy all of their needs.
And maybe people listening today will feel inspired to support their local newspaper, whether that's a hyper-local one or a book of essays or the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So Antonio French of the North Sider and the South Sider, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Jeanette Cooperman of the Common Reader, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And St. Louis Post-Dispatch editor Gilbert Bailon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.